The autumn wind swept across the Montana Territory in 1878, carrying with it the scent of dying grass and distant snow. 6-year-old Little Moon pressed her face against the rough wooden slats of their trading post, watching her father Thunderhorse load supplies into their wagon. But it wasn't the approaching winter that would change their lives forever. It was the woman they found chained to a tree with a burlap sack covering her head, barely breathing, abandoned like a discarded piece of cargo in the wilderness. "Papa, why won't she move?" Little Moon would ask, not knowing that the broken woman before them would soon become the heart of their small family, transforming their quiet existence into something neither of them had ever dared to dream possible. Thunderhorse had been tracking the wounded elk for 3 hours when he first heard the sound that made his blood run cold. It wasn't the cry of an animal or the whistle of wind through the canyon rocks. It was the soft, desperate whimpering of a human being in distress. He dismounted from his spotted pony and motioned for Little Moon to stay quiet, her dark eyes wide with curiosity as she clutched her small bow made from willow branches. The Cherokee warrior moved through the tall grass with the silence of his ancestors, every sense alert to danger. The Montana Territory was unforgiving land, where outlaws and renegades often left their victims to die slow, horrible deaths. What he found in the clearing beyond the cottonwood grove was worse than anything he had prepared himself to see. A woman sat propped against an ancient oak tree, her wrists bound with heavy iron chains that had rubbed her skin raw and bloody. A coarse burlap sack had been pulled over her head and tied tightly around her neck, preventing her from seeing or calling for help. Her dress, once probably blue calico, was torn and stained with mud and what looked like dried blood. Her feet were bare, cut and swollen from walking over rough ground. Thunderhorse had seen many cruelties in his 32 years, but something about this scene struck him like a physical blow to the chest. The woman was barely moving, her chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths that suggested she had been here for at least a day, maybe longer. Whoever had done this to her wanted her to die slowly, alone and terrified in the wilderness. "Little Moon," he called softly in Cherokee, "come here, but stay behind me." His daughter approached on silent feet, her deerskin moccasins making no sound on the forest floor. When she saw the bound woman, her small gasp echoed in the clearing like a bird's cry. "Papa, why won't she move?" Little Moon whispered, her voice filled with the innocent concern of a child who had never seen such deliberate cruelty. Thunderhorse knelt beside the woman, his experienced hands checking for signs of life while his eyes scanned the surrounding area for potential threats. The woman's pulse was weak but steady, and when he gently touched her shoulder, she flinched away with a muffled cry of terror. She was conscious but completely disoriented, probably assuming that her captors had returned to finish what they had started. Thunderhorse spoke to her in English, his voice low and reassuring despite the anger burning in his chest. "You are safe now. I'm going to help you. Do not be afraid." The woman's body went rigid at the sound of his voice, and Thunderhorse realized she was probably more terrified of him than grateful for rescue. In 1878 Montana, many white settlers viewed Native Americans with suspicion and fear, regardless of the circumstances, working carefully. Thunderhorse used his hunting knife to cut through the rope holding the sack over her head. When the burlap fell away, he found himself looking into the most haunting blue eyes he had ever seen. The woman was perhaps 25 years old, with tangled auburn hair and a face that would have been beautiful if not for the purple bruises covering her cheeks and forehead. Little Moon stepped closer, her natural compassion overcoming her father's cautions about staying back. "She's hurt, Papa. Look at her hands." The iron shackles had cut deep grooves into the woman's wrists, and dried blood had crusted around the metal cuffs. Whoever had chained her had used restraints meant for the most dangerous criminals. Thunderhorse examined the locks on the shackles, recognizing the crude but effective ironwork of a frontier blacksmith. Breaking these chains would require proper tools back at their trading post. But first, they needed to get this woman to safety before her condition worsened. or her captors returned to check on their handiwork. "Can you speak?" Thunderhorse asked gently, offering the woman his water gourd. She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether he was real or another hallucination brought on by dehydration and trauma. When she finally opened her mouth, only a hoarse whisper emerged. "Please," she managed, her voice raw from screaming through the burlap sack. "Please don't hurt me. I have nothing left to take." The words broke Thunderhorse's heart, revealing the depth of what this woman had already endured. Little Moon reached out instinctively to touch the woman's face, her small fingers gentle as butterfly wings. Getting Elizabeth Stone, though they wouldn't learn her name for several more days, back to the trading post proved more challenging than Thunderhorse had anticipated. The woman was weak from exposure and dehydration, barely able to stand even with his support. The iron chains around her wrists made it impossible for her to balance properly, and every movement sent fresh pain through her battered body. Thunderhorse made the decision to lift her onto his horse, positioning her in front of him where he could support her weight while maintaining control of the animal. Little Moon rode behind them on their pack horse, her worried eyes never leaving the mysterious woman who had appeared in their lives like a broken angel fallen from heaven. The journey back to their small trading post took over an hour, with Thunderhorse stopping frequently to give Elizabeth water and check on her condition. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling words that made no sense, other times crying out in fear when she forgot where she was or who had rescued her. During one of her more lucid moments, Elizabeth looked up at Thunderhorse with those striking blue eyes and asked a question that would haunt him for weeks to come. "Why are you helping me? Don't you know what I've done?" Before he could respond, she had slipped back into the fevered delirium that seemed to claim her whenever she tried to remember her recent past. Their trading post sat in a narrow valley between two ridges, protected from the worst of the Montana winters, but still isolated enough that visitors were rare and usually announced their presence long before arriving. Thunderhorse had built the log structure himself 5 years earlier, after Little Moon's mother died, giving birth to what would have been their second child. The main building served as both their home and the trading post, where local ranchers and occasional travelers could buy supplies or trade for the furs and crafted goods that Thunderhorse provided. Behind the main structure stood a smaller cabin that had originally been intended as a workshop, but now seemed like the perfect place to house their unexpected guest. Little Moon helped her father carry Elizabeth into the small cabin, chattering nervously in Cherokee about how they should take care of the hurt woman. Thunderhorse listened to his daughter's innocent suggestions, while his own mind wrestled with the implications of what they were doing. Harboring a woman who might be a wanted criminal could bring serious trouble to their isolated home. But looking at Elizabeth's battered condition, Thunderhorse knew he could never have left her chained to that tree to die. Whatever crimes she might have committed, whatever circumstances had led to her brutal punishment, no human being deserved to suffer such deliberate cruelty. His Cherokee upbringing had taught him that all life was sacred, and that helping those in need was a fundamental responsibility. The first priority was getting those iron shackles off Elizabeth's wrists before infection set in around the deep cuts they had caused. Thunderhorse retrieved his heaviest hammer and cold chisel from the workshop, tools he normally used for shoeing horses and repairing wagon wheels. Breaking chains designed to hold dangerous prisoners would require precision and patience. Elizabeth was only semi-conscious when Thunderhorse began working on the first shackle, but the sound of metal striking metal brought her fully awake with a cry of terror. She tried to pull away, convinced that her captors had returned to inflict more punishment, until Little Moon's gentle voice broke through her panic. "It's all right, lady. Papa is making the bad chains go away. See? He's helping you." Little Moon held Elizabeth's free hand while Thunderhorse worked, her small fingers providing an anchor of comfort in the woman's world of fear and confusion. Something about the child's innocent presence seemed to calm Elizabeth's worst anxieties. The work was slow and dangerous, requiring Thunderhorse to position the chisel carefully to avoid injuring Elizabeth further, while applying enough force to break the tempered iron. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool autumn air, and his muscles ached from the repetitive hammering motion. Little Moon wiped Elizabeth's face with a cool cloth, murmuring soft words of encouragement. When the first shackle finally broke away, Elizabeth stared at her freed wrist as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Fresh blood seeped from the deep cuts where the iron had bitten into her flesh. But for the first time since they had found her, something resembling hope flickered in her blue eyes. The second shackle proved even more stubborn, its lock mechanism jammed with dried blood and debris. Thunderhorse had to work at multiple angles, carefully chipping away at the metal, while Elizabeth gritted her teeth against the jarring impacts. When it finally gave way, she collapsed forward into Little Moon's arms, sobbing with relief and exhaustion. That evening, Thunderhorse prepared a simple meal of venison stew and cornbread, while Little Moon appointed herself as Elizabeth's caretaker. The child seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of what the traumatized woman needed, offering water without being asked and adjusting the blankets around Elizabeth's shoulders when she began to shiver. Elizabeth ate very little, her hands shaking too badly to hold a spoon steady. When Thunderhorse offered to help feed her, she flinched away with a look of such terror that he realized any sudden movement or gesture might send her into complete panic. Instead, he placed the bowl within her reach and retreated to the far side of the small cabin. "What's your name, lady?" Little Moon asked in her direct, childlike way. Elizabeth looked at the girl for a long moment, as if the question required enormous concentration to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Elizabeth. Elizabeth Stone." The name seemed to cause her physical pain to speak, and fresh tears began streaming down her bruised cheeks. Thunderhorse noticed how she glanced toward the door constantly, as if expecting someone to burst in and drag her back into chains. Little Moon seemed satisfied with this basic information and continued her gentle interrogation. "Are you hungry? Papa makes good stew. Do you like cornbread?" "I helped make it." Elizabeth managed a weak smile at the child's chatter, the first sign of any positive emotion since they had found her. As the evening progressed, Thunderhorse began to piece together fragments of Elizabeth's story from her occasional, coherent statements. She had been traveling with someone she referred to only as him, and something had gone terribly wrong during their journey. She spoke of a town called Cedar Falls, though Thunderhorse wasn't familiar with any settlement by that name in the Montana Territory. More troubling were her references to what I did and the money that's gone. Elizabeth seemed convinced that she deserved the punishment she had received, though she couldn't or wouldn't explain what crime she believed she had committed. Thunderhorse suspected that guilt and trauma were mixing in her mind, creating a distorted version of recent events. When it came time to settle Elizabeth for the night, Little Moon insisted on staying in the small cabin to keep their guest company. "She might have bad dreams, Papa. Mama used to have bad dreams before she went to the spirit world." Thunderhorse's heart clenched at his daughter's mention of her deceased mother. But he recognized the wisdom in Little Moon's suggestion. Thunderhorse set up his own bedroll near the cabin's entrance, positioned where he could intercept any potential threats while still giving Elizabeth privacy. The woman seemed grateful for this arrangement, though she continued to start at every small sound throughout the night. Around midnight, Elizabeth began crying out in her sleep, reliving whatever trauma had led to her captivity. Her words were mostly incoherent, but Thunderhorse caught fragments that chilled his blood. "Please don't leave me here to die, and I'll pay it back. I swear I'll pay it back." Little Moon woke at the sounds of distress and crawled over to stroke Elizabeth's hair until the nightmares passed. Dawn brought new challenges and deeper mysteries. Elizabeth woke with a fever, her body finally succumbing to the infections and trauma of her ordeal. Thunderhorse recognized the signs of serious illness and knew they needed medical supplies that he didn't have at the isolated trading post. "Papa, she's burning up," Little Moon reported. Her small hand pressed against Elizabeth's forehead. The child's face showed worry beyond her 6 years, already bonding with the mysterious woman who had entered their lives. Thunderhorse felt his own concern deepening as he watched Elizabeth shiver despite the warmth radiating from her skin. While treating Elizabeth's fever with willow bark tea and cool compresses, Thunderhorse discovered something that changed everything. Hidden beneath Elizabeth's torn dress was a money belt, still containing a significant amount of gold coins and paper currency. The discovery raised new questions about her identity and the circumstances of her captivity. Even more intriguing was a small leather journal tucked into the belt, its pages filled with neat handwriting that documented what appeared to be financial transactions and business dealings. Thunderhorse couldn't read English well enough to decipher the details, but the numbers suggested Elizabeth had been involved in substantial commercial activities. When Elizabeth briefly regained consciousness later that morning, Thunderhorse showed her the money belt. Her reaction was immediate and intense. She grabbed his arm with surprising strength and whispered urgently, "Hide it. Please hide it. If they find it, they'll kill us all." The terror in her voice convinced Thunderhorse that whatever had happened to Elizabeth, the money was central to her troubles. Little Moon, meanwhile, had been studying Elizabeth's face with the intense curiosity of a child trying to solve a puzzle. "Papa," she said in Cherokee, "I think she's not just sick in her body. I think she's sick in her heart too, like you were after Mama died." The observation showed remarkable insight for someone so young. As Thunderhorse prepared to ride to the nearest settlement for medical supplies, Elizabeth grabbed his hand one more time. Through her fever, she looked directly into his eyes and said something that would echo in his mind for days to come. "They'll come looking for me. When they do, don't let them take me back. Promise me you won't let them take me back." The desperation in her voice suggested that whatever Elizabeth Stone was running from, it was worse than death itself. Thunderhorse knelt beside her makeshift bed and spoke the words that would bind their fates together. "You are under my protection now. No one will take you anywhere you do not wish to go." It was a promise that would soon be tested in ways he never could have imagined. As the first riders appeared on the horizon, heading directly for their isolated trading post with the grim determination of men who had come to collect what they believed belonged to them. Thunderhorse had barely mounted his horse when the dust cloud appeared on the eastern ridge, moving with the purposeful speed of riders who knew exactly where they were heading. 3 men on horseback, their silhouettes dark against the morning sky, riding hard toward the trading post with an urgency that spoke of business rather than casual travel. Thunderhorse's hand instinctively moved to the rifle secured to his saddle, his warrior instincts recognizing danger long before his mind processed the specific threat. Inside the small cabin, Elizabeth's fever had worsened, and she thrashed restlessly on the makeshift bed, mumbling incoherent warnings about the money and what they'll do when they find out. Little Moon sat beside her, pressing cool cloths to Elizabeth's burning forehead while singing a Cherokee lullaby her grandmother had taught her years before her death. The child's voice was sweet and pure, a stark contrast to the violence that Thunderhorse sensed approaching their peaceful valley. The lead rider was a tall man, with silver hair beneath a black hat, his face weathered by decades of hard living on the frontier. Even from a distance, Thunderhorse could see the badge pinned to his vest and the confident way he sat his horse, marking him as someone accustomed to authority and getting his way. The 2 men flanking him looked like hired guns rather than lawmen, their hands resting casually near their weapons as they surveyed the trading post with calculating eyes. Thunderhorse made a quick decision that would prove crucial in the hours to come. Instead of riding out to meet the strangers, he turned his horse back toward the cabin and called softly to Little Moon in Cherokee. "Take our guest to the root cellar beneath the main house. Cover the entrance with the old blanket and do not come out until I call for you personally." His daughter's eyes widened with understanding, and she immediately began helping Elizabeth to her feet, despite the woman's weakened condition. The root cellar had been dug deep into the hillside behind their main building, originally designed to keep food supplies cool during the harsh Montana summers. Thunderhorse had reinforced it with thick timber supports and created a hidden entrance that looked like nothing more than a storage area for old blankets and winter clothing. It was the perfect hiding place for someone who needed to disappear quickly. Elizabeth seemed to understand the gravity of the situation despite her fever, allowing Little Moon to guide her down the narrow wooden steps into the cool darkness below ground. "If they find me," Elizabeth whispered to the child, "tell them you never saw me. Promise me you'll say you never saw me." Little Moon nodded solemnly, though Thunderhorse could see the confusion and fear in his daughter's dark eyes. By the time the three riders reached the trading post, Thunderhorse had positioned himself casually on the front porch, cleaning his rifle with the unhurried manner of a man who had nothing to hide. The lead rider dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle, his pale eyes scanning the buildings and surrounding area with professional thoroughness. "Morning," the man said, touching the brim of his hat, in a gesture that might have seemed polite, if not for the cold calculation in his voice. "Name's Marshal Garrett Coleman. I'm looking for a woman who might have passed through these parts recently. White woman, mid-20s, auburn hair, probably traveling alone or with unsavory companions." The way he emphasized the word unsavory carried an unmistakable threat. Thunderhorse continued cleaning his rifle, taking his time to consider his response. In his experience, lawmen who traveled with hired guns were rarely interested in justice, and something about Marshal Coleman's demeanor suggested this was a personal matter rather than official business. "Don't see many travelers this far from the main trails," Thunderhorse replied carefully. "What's this woman wanted for?" Coleman's smile was thin and humorless. "Theft. Grand larceny, to be specific. She stole a considerable sum of money from her employer and disappeared into the territory. The man she robbed is offering a substantial reward for her return, alive and unharmed." The marshal's emphasis on alive and unharmed sounded more like a threat than a reassurance, and Thunderhorse noticed how the two gunmen shifted in their saddles. "You're Cherokee, aren't you?" Coleman continued, his tone becoming more conversational but no less dangerous. "I've heard your people have a different understanding of property rights than civilized folk. Might be inclined to help a thief if the price was right." The racial slur was delivered with casual cruelty, designed to provoke a reaction that would give Coleman an excuse for violence. Thunderhorse's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level and respectful. "I understand property rights just fine, Marshal. If someone stole money, they should return it and face the consequences. But I haven't seen any white women in weeks." The lie came easily, justified by his growing certainty that these men intended Elizabeth harm, regardless of her guilt or innocence. One of the gunmen, a lean man with a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, spat tobacco juice into the dust and spoke for the first time. "Maybe we should take a look around, just to be thorough. These Indian trading posts sometimes have hidden rooms, places where folks might hide stolen goods or wanted criminals." His hand rested on the butt of his revolver as he made the suggestion. Coleman nodded approvingly. "Good thinking, Hayes. We wouldn't want to leave any stone unturned in our search for justice." The marshal's tone made it clear that he expected Thunderhorse to cooperate fully, and that resistance would be met with immediate violence. Thunderhorse calculated the odds of successfully fighting 3 armed men while protecting Little Moon and Elizabeth, and found them discouragingly poor. The search of Thunderhorse's property was thorough and deliberately destructive, designed to humiliate as much as to find evidence. Marshal Coleman and his men overturned furniture, scattered clothing and supplies, and pried up floorboards, looking for hidden spaces. They moved through the main house like a plague of locusts, leaving chaos and broken belongings in their wake. Thunderhorse followed them silently, noting every item they damaged and every liberty they took with his property. His Cherokee training had taught him patience and strategic thinking, qualities that served him well as he watched these men destroy his carefully organized home. Little Moon remained hidden in the root cellar with Elizabeth, hopefully far enough underground to avoid detection. "Nice place you got here," the scarred gunman called Hayes commented sarcastically as he kicked over a basket of Little Moon's hand-woven dolls. "Must be profitable, trading with outlaws and renegades. Bet you see all sorts of interesting merchandise pass through here." He picked up one of the dolls and examined it with mock interest before tossing it into the fireplace. The third man, who had remained silent until now, was systematically examining the walls and floors for signs of hidden compartments. He was older than his companions, with grey stubble and the methodical manner of someone experienced in finding things that others wanted to keep hidden. "Got a cellar under this place?" he asked Thunderhorse directly. "Storm cellar out back," Thunderhorse replied truthfully. "Keeps the winter supplies from freezing." He led them to the obvious cellar entrance near the main house, a stone-lined pit that contained barrels of salt pork, dried beans, and preserved vegetables. The searchers spent 20 minutes examining every container and probing the walls for secret passages. Marshal Coleman was growing increasingly frustrated with their lack of results. "She was seen heading this direction 3 days ago. Local rancher spotted a woman matching her description near Willow Creek, not 10 miles from here. She has to be somewhere in this area." His voice carried the edge of a man who was not accustomed to failure. Hayes suggested expanding their search to the surrounding countryside, but Coleman shook his head. "She's hurt and on foot. Wouldn't get far in this terrain without help. Someone's hiding her and they're going to tell us where." His pale eyes fixed on Thunderhorse with unmistakable menace. The systematic destruction of his home continued for another hour, with the searchers becoming increasingly violent in their methods. They slashed open mattresses, broke dishes, and scattered Thunderhorse's carefully preserved books and maps across the floor. It was clear that they were no longer just searching for Elizabeth, but punishing Thunderhorse for his perceived lack of cooperation. During the search, Thunderhorse overheard fragments of conversation between the 3 men that revealed the true nature of their mission. Elizabeth hadn't stolen money from an employer. She had discovered evidence of embezzlement and corruption in a territorial government office where she worked as a bookkeeper. The stolen money was actually her evidence of the crime, and these men were here to silence her permanently. "Boss wants this handled quiet-like," Hayes muttered to his companion as they ransacked Thunderhorse's workshop. "Can't have her talking to the wrong people about what she saw in them ledgers. Too much at stake for too many important folks." The casual way they discussed Elizabeth's murder chilled Thunderhorse's blood. Coleman's growing desperation became apparent as the search continued without results. "Maybe we need to ask some harder questions," he suggested, his hand moving to the coiled whip attached to his saddle. "Indians sometimes need stronger persuasion to remember things clearly." The threat was unmistakable, and Thunderhorse began calculating his chances of reaching his rifle before Coleman could draw his weapon. The situation reached its breaking point when Hayes discovered fresh horse tracks leading away from the trading post toward the North Ridge. The tracks were several hours old, made when Thunderhorse had initially started his journey to get medical supplies, but the gunman interpreted them as evidence that Elizabeth had been moved to another location. "Looks like our Cherokee friend has been helping our fugitive after all," Coleman announced with grim satisfaction. Fresh tracks, multiple horses, heading into the high country where a man could hide someone for weeks. He turned to face Thunderhorse with the predatory smile of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. "No." Thunderhorse realized that denying knowledge of the tracks would be pointless. They were clearly visible to anyone with basic tracking skills. Instead, he decided on a different strategy, one that might buy time for Little Moon and Elizabeth while putting himself in greater danger. "I found an injured woman 2 days ago," Thunderhorse admitted carefully. "White woman, hurt bad. Couldn't tell me her name or where she came from. I took her to the missionary settlement at Pine Ridge for medical attention." The lie was plausible. Pine Ridge was a real settlement about 30 miles north, and the tracks could reasonably be interpreted as heading in that direction. Coleman's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But there was also a gleam of interest in his expression. Pine Ridge was far enough away to require a substantial journey, but close enough to be believable. More importantly, it was in the opposite direction from where Elizabeth was actually hidden. You expect us to believe you'd help a white woman out of the goodness of your red heart, Hayes sneered. More likely you're planning to sell her to the highest bidder. Or maybe you got other uses for a pretty white woman. The implications of his words were disgusting, and Thunderhorse felt his carefully controlled temper begin to slip. The older gunman, who had remained quiet during most of the search, stepped forward with a more thoughtful expression. Pine Ridge is a hard ride from here. If she was hurt as bad as you claim, might not have survived the journey. It would be a waste of time chasing shadows. His practical assessment seemed to give Coleman pause. Thunderhorse pressed his advantage. Woman was dying when I found her. Figured the missionaries might save her life, maybe get her to confess her sins before she passed. Seemed like the Christian thing to do. The reference to confession was deliberate. If Elizabeth had died at Pine Ridge, any secrets she carried would have died with her. Coleman weighed his options for several long minutes, clearly torn between pursuing the lead to Pine Ridge and continuing to search the immediate area. Thunderhorse could see the calculation in the marshal's eyes. If Elizabeth was indeed at Pine Ridge, every hour of delay decreased their chances of finding her alive. But if she was still hidden somewhere nearby, leaving now would give her time to escape. The decision was made when one of Coleman's horses showed signs of lameness, favoring its left front hoof in a way that suggested a stone bruise or loose shoe. Pursuing a lead 30 miles away with a lame horse would be dangerous and potentially futile, especially with winter weather threatening to close the mountain passes. We'll check Pine Ridge, Coleman decided finally. But if we find out you've been lying to us, Cherokee, we'll be back to have a more serious conversation about honesty and cooperation. The threat was delivered with the cold certainty of a man who had carried out such promises many times before. Thunderhorse nodded respectfully, keeping his expression neutral despite the relief flooding through his chest. I understand, Marshal. Hope you find what you're looking for. The formal politeness of his response seemed to satisfy Coleman's need for dominance, at least temporarily. As the three riders prepared to leave for Pine Ridge, Thunderhorse maintained his casual demeanor, while internally calculating how much time their departure would give him to prepare for their inevitable return. Coleman was too experienced and too determined to be fooled for long. When they failed to find Elizabeth at the missionary settlement, they would return with increased suspicion and decreased patience. The marshal paused at the edge of the property to deliver one final warning. We'll be back through this area in a few days, on our way to check other settlements. Might stop by to see how you're getting along, maybe bring some friends who are better at finding things that don't want to be found. The meaning was clear. Thunderhorse had bought time, but not safety. Hayes spat another stream of tobacco, juice, and added his own threat. Funny how trading posts sometimes catch fire during dry weather. Real tragedy when that happens, especially if folks are trapped inside during the blaze. The casual way he discussed arson and murder revealed the true nature of the men Thunderhorse was dealing with. After the riders disappeared over the Eastern Ridge, Thunderhorse waited another 30 minutes before approaching the hidden root cellar. The silence that followed their departure felt ominous rather than peaceful, as if the very air around the trading post had been poisoned by the presence of such violent men. "Little Moon," he called softly in Cherokee. "The bad men have gone away. You can come out now." The response was immediate, the sound of movement below ground, followed by his daughter's voice asking if it was truly safe to emerge. Thunderhorse assured her that the immediate danger had passed, though he knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Elizabeth appeared at the top of the cellar steps, supported by Little Moon, her fever still raging, but her eyes alert with intelligence and fear. She had obviously overheard at least part of the confrontation above ground, and her first words confirmed Thunderhorse's suspicions about her true situation. "They weren't lawmen, were they?" Elizabeth asked weakly, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Real marshals don't travel with hired killers, and they don't threaten to burn down houses with children inside." Her assessment of Coleman and his men was grimly accurate. Thunderhorse helped Elizabeth back to her makeshift bed while Little Moon began cleaning up the damage left by their unwelcome visitors. The destruction was extensive, but not irreparable. Furniture could be mended, dishes replaced, scattered belongings reorganized. The greater damage was to Thunderhorse's sense of security in their isolated valley. As Elizabeth settled back onto her blankets, she looked directly into Thunderhorse's eyes, with an expression of desperate gratitude mixed with crushing guilt. "You lied to protect me. You put yourself and your daughter in danger for someone you don't even know. Why would you do such a thing?" The question carried the weight of someone who had lost faith in human kindness. Thunderhorse considered his answer carefully before speaking. "My people believe that all life is sacred, and that we are responsible for protecting those who cannot protect themselves. You came to us broken and afraid, seeking nothing but the chance to survive. What you did before that moment does not matter as much as what we choose to do now." His words carried the wisdom of his Cherokee ancestors and the hard-earned experience of a man who had faced his own share of injustice. Little Moon, who had been listening to their conversation while tidying the cabin, approached Elizabeth's bedside with the innocent directness that only children possess. "Don't worry, lady. Papa is the strongest and smartest man in the whole territory. He won't let the bad men hurt you." Her confidence was absolute, though Thunderhorse wished he shared his daughter's certainty about their chances of survival. With Coleman and his killers temporarily diverted to Pine Ridge, Thunderhorse could finally focus on Elizabeth's deteriorating medical condition without the constant threat of discovery hanging over them. Her fever had spiked dangerously high during the stress of hiding in the root cellar, and the infected wounds on her wrists were showing the angry red streaks that indicated blood poisoning was beginning to spread through her system. Little Moon proved to be an invaluable assistant in treating Elizabeth's injuries, her small hands gentle as she helped clean and rebandage the deep cuts left by the iron shackles. The child had inherited her late mother's natural healing instincts, somehow knowing exactly when to apply cool compresses and when to encourage Elizabeth to drink the bitter willow bark tea that would help break her fever. During Elizabeth's more lucid moments over the next 2 days, fragments of her true story began to emerge, like pieces of a shattered mirror slowly being reassembled. She had worked as a bookkeeper and clerk for the Territorial Government Office in Helena, a position that required her to maintain detailed records of land sales, mining claims, and tax collections throughout the Montana Territory. The work had been routine and seemingly respectable until Elizabeth began noticing discrepancies in the financial records that couldn't be explained by simple clerical errors. Large sums of money were being diverted from legitimate government accounts into private holdings, and land grants were being issued to fictitious individuals who existed only on paper. "I should have kept quiet," Elizabeth whispered to Thunderhorse during one of her stronger moments, her blue eyes filled with regret and self-recrimination. I should have pretended I didn't see what was happening and just done my job like everyone else. But I kept thinking about all the honest settlers who were being cheated out of their rightful claims, all the tax money that was being stolen from schools and hospitals. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had discovered that doing the right thing could be the most dangerous choice of all. The corruption extended far beyond simple embezzlement, reaching into the highest levels of territorial government, and involving some of the most prominent businessmen and politicians in Montana. When Elizabeth began copying incriminating documents and preparing to present her evidence to federal authorities, she unknowingly signed her own death warrant. Thunderhorse learned that Elizabeth's direct supervisor, a man named Harrison Blackwood, had discovered her investigation and confronted her in the government office after hours. What should have been a simple conversation about suspicious financial records had quickly escalated into threats and then violence when Blackwood realized the extent of Elizabeth's knowledge about the corruption scheme. He told me that too. Many important people had too much to lose for me to be allowed to present my evidence to anyone, Elizabeth continued, her voice growing stronger as she relived the traumatic events. He said I could either disappear quietly with a substantial payment for my silence, or I could disappear permanently in a way that would serve as a warning to other potential whistleblowers. The choice had been no choice at all. Elizabeth had attempted to flee Helena with her evidence, hoping to reach the federal courthouse in Denver, where she could present her findings to authorities who weren't part of the territorial corruption network. But Blackwood had anticipated her escape route and arranged for her capture before she could leave Montana. The men who had abducted Elizabeth weren't common criminals or frontier outlaws, but hired professionals brought in specifically to handle politically sensitive problems that required permanent solutions. They had chained her to that tree, not as punishment for theft, but as a slow execution designed to look like the random violence that claimed many travelers in the dangerous territories. They wanted it to appear that I had been killed by wild animals or hostile Indians, Elizabeth explained with bitter clarity. My death would serve as both an elimination of a threat and a deterrent to anyone else who might consider investigating government corruption. Marshal Coleman isn't a real lawman. He's Harrison Blackwood's personal enforcer, and those men with him are killers who specialize in making problems disappear. The revelation explained the casual brutality Thunderhorse had witnessed during their search of his property. Little Moon, who had been listening to these revelations with the intense concentration of a child trying to understand adult complexities, asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter: why didn't you give them the papers they wanted? Then they would have left you alone. Her innocent inquiry revealed the tragic flaw in Elizabeth's situation. Because the papers are the only thing keeping me alive, Elizabeth replied softly. As long as Harrison Blackwood believes I might have hidden copies of the evidence somewhere, he needs to keep me alive long enough to find out where they are. The moment he's certain that all the incriminating documents have been destroyed, I become expendable. The cold logic of her situation was as inescapable as the iron chains that had bound her to that tree. Thunderhorse's discovery of Elizabeth's money belt had revealed more than gold coins and currency. Hidden beneath the false bottom of the leather pouch were carefully folded documents that represented months of painstaking investigation into territorial government corruption. The papers were covered with Elizabeth's neat handwriting, documenting financial discrepancies, fraudulent land transactions, and illegal diversions of federal funds. As Elizabeth's fever subsided and her strength began to return, she was able to explain the significance of each document and how it fit into the larger pattern of systematic theft and fraud. The evidence was damning and comprehensive, providing a clear trail of criminal activity that implicated dozens of prominent individuals throughout the Montana Territory. This ledger shows how mining claims were being sold to the same phantom investors under different names, Elizabeth explained, pointing to one of the documents with a trembling finger. The same individuals would purchase claims, extract the most valuable resources, then abandon the properties without paying the required taxes or reclamation fees. The territorial government lost hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue, while a select few became enormously wealthy. The scope of the fraud was staggering. Another set of documents revealed how federal funds designated for Indian reservation supplies and services were being systematically diverted into private accounts. Food, blankets, and medical supplies that were supposed to be distributed to Native American communities were instead being sold on the black market, with the profits disappearing into the pockets of corrupt officials. Tuti Sin, Thunderhorse felt a surge of anger as he realized how this corruption had directly affected his own people and countless other Native American families throughout the territory. The chronic shortages of supplies and medical care on reservations weren't just the result of federal indifference. They were the deliberate consequence of organized theft by men who viewed Indian suffering as an acceptable cost of their personal enrichment. The worst part, Elizabeth continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke about the evidence she had risked her life to preserve, is that these aren't just financial crimes. People have died because of what these men have done. Families have starved on reservations while their allocated supplies were sold to the highest bidder. Settlers have been killed trying to defend land claims that were never legally theirs because the proper procedures weren't followed. The human cost of the corruption gave Elizabeth's evidence a moral weight that transcended simple financial fraud. Little Moon had been examining one of the documents with the intense curiosity of a child who was learning to read English, her small finger tracing the lines of Elizabeth's careful handwriting. "What does this word mean?" she asked, pointing to a notation that appeared frequently throughout the papers. "Appropriation," Elizabeth explained gently. "It means money that's supposed to be used for specific purposes, like building schools or buying medicine for sick people. But these men were taking that money and using it for themselves instead of helping the people it was meant to help." The child's face showed confusion and dismay as she began to understand the magnitude of the theft. Thunderhorse realized that Elizabeth's evidence represented far more than a personal vendetta against corrupt officials. It was potentially the key to exposing a criminal network that had been systematically victimizing both white settlers and Native American communities throughout the Montana Territory. The documents in her possession could bring justice to countless victims and prevent future exploitation. But the same evidence that made Elizabeth invaluable as a witness also made her an extremely dangerous liability to the men she was prepared to expose. Harrison Blackwood and his associates couldn't allow her to survive long enough to present her findings to federal authorities, which meant that protecting Elizabeth was about far more than saving one woman's life. "How many copies of these documents exist?" Thunderhorse asked, recognizing the strategic importance of the information. Elizabeth's answer was both encouraging and terrifying. "I made 3 complete sets. One is hidden in Helena, one was supposed to be delivered to Denver, and this is the 3rd. If Blackwood's men find and destroy all 3 sets, then everything I've discovered dies with me. The stakes couldn't have been higher." As Elizabeth's physical condition stabilized and her mental clarity returned, Thunderhorse began developing a strategy that would allow them to turn the tables on their pursuers while ensuring the crucial evidence reached the proper authorities. The plan would be dangerous and would require precise timing, but it offered their best chance of survival and justice. The first element of Thunderhorse's strategy involved creating a false trail that would keep Coleman and his killers occupied while Elizabeth recovered her strength and prepared for the journey to Denver. Using his knowledge of the local terrain and weather patterns, Thunderhorse could lead their enemies on a chase through some of the most treacherous country in the Montana Territory. "Pine Ridge is a dead end," Thunderhorse explained to Elizabeth as he outlined his plan. When Coleman realizes you're not there, he'll backtrack toward my trading post, but I'll make sure he picks up a trail leading into the Bitterroot Mountains instead. Those peaks are already getting snow, and the passes will be dangerous for men who don't know the country. I can keep them occupied for days while you prepare for your journey to Denver. The plan was bold but risky. Elizabeth protested that she couldn't allow Thunderhorse to put himself in such danger on her behalf, but he firmly rejected her objections. "This isn't just about you anymore," he told her with quiet conviction. "The evidence you carry could help my people and countless others who have been victimized by these criminals. I have a responsibility to see that justice is done, regardless of the personal cost." His determination was absolute and unshakable. Little Moon had been listening to their planning session with growing excitement, her child's mind already envisioning herself as part of the adventure. "I want to help too, Papa. I can ride fast and hide in places the bad men would never think to look." Her eagerness was touching. But Thunderhorse knew that involving his daughter in such a dangerous enterprise would be unthinkably reckless. The debate about Little Moon's involvement was settled by Elizabeth herself, who recognized that the child possessed skills and knowledge that could prove crucial to their success. "She knows this country better than any of us," Elizabeth pointed out, "and she's small enough to move through terrain that would stop a grown man. We might need her help more than we realize." Thunderhorse remained reluctant, but he couldn't deny the logic of Elizabeth's argument. The second phase of Thunderhorse's plan involved establishing contact with trustworthy individuals who could help ensure Elizabeth's evidence reached federal authorities, even if something happened to her during the journey to Denver. Thunderhorse had connections throughout the territory, trading partners, old friends from his army scouting days, and members of various tribal communities who had reason to want the corruption exposed. "There's a man named Captain Morrison at Fort Ellis who owes me several favors from our time serving together," Thunderhorse explained. "He's honest and has connections to federal investigators who aren't part of the territorial government structure. If we can get word to him about what you've discovered, he can provide protection and ensure your evidence reaches the right people." The military connection offered their best hope for success. Elizabeth's face showed the first genuine hope Thunderhorse had seen since they found her chained to that tree. "You really think we can expose these criminals and bring them to justice?" she asked, her voice carrying a mixture of desperate longing and cautious skepticism. The possibility of vindication and safety seemed almost too good to believe after everything she had endured. Thunderhorse's response was firm and confident. "I think we have a chance, if we're smart and careful and willing to take some calculated risks. These men have been operating with impunity because they believed no one would dare challenge them. It's time to prove them wrong." His words carried the weight of a warrior's oath and the determination of a man who had found a cause worth fighting for. Little Moon clapped her hands together with delight, her young mind already embracing the adventure that lay ahead. "We're going to be heroes, aren't we, Papa? We're going to help Elizabeth save all the people who were hurt by the bad men." Her innocent enthusiasm was infectious, reminding both adults that they were fighting for more than just their own survival. Even as Thunderhorse and Elizabeth refined their plans for exposing the corruption network, the immediate threat of Coleman's return continued to loom over their isolated valley like an approaching thunderstorm. Thunderhorse's deception about sending Elizabeth to Pine Ridge had bought them precious time, but that reprieve was rapidly coming to an end. The weather was changing rapidly as autumn gave way to an early winter, with snow already falling in the higher elevations and temperatures dropping dangerously low during the night hours. These conditions would make travel treacherous for everyone, but they also provided opportunities for those who knew how to use the harsh Montana climate to their advantage. Thunderhorse had been monitoring the eastern approaches to his property, watching for the telltale signs of riders who might be returning from their fruitless journey to Pine Ridge. His experience as an army scout had taught him to read the subtle indicators that warned of approaching danger long before it became visible to untrained eyes. On the morning of the fourth day since Coleman's departure, Thunderhorse spotted the ominous signs he had been dreading, circling vultures in the distance, the kind of scavenging behavior that typically followed human violence. The birds were concentrated over an area roughly 15 miles to the northeast, along the route that Coleman and his men would have taken on their return journey from Pine Ridge. "They're coming back," Thunderhorse announced grimly as he returned from his morning reconnaissance. "And I think they may have encountered other travelers along the way." The implications of his observation were chilling. Coleman and his killers had probably left a trail of bodies during their increasingly desperate search for Elizabeth. Elizabeth's face went pale as she realized what Thunderhorse's warning meant. "How long do we have before they reach us?" she asked, already beginning to gather her few possessions in preparation for immediate flight. The casual ease with which she prepared for danger spoke to the constant fear she had been living with since her escape from Helena. "Hours, not days," Thunderhorse replied honestly. "They'll be angry, frustrated, and ready to use extreme methods to get the information they want. We can't be here when they arrive. The time for elaborate plans and careful preparation had run out. They would have to implement their escape strategy immediately, regardless of whether they were fully ready." Little Moon had been unusually quiet during this exchange, her young mind processing the reality that their peaceful life at the trading post was about to end forever. When she finally spoke, her words carried a wisdom beyond her years. "Papa, are we going to have to leave our home?" The question struck at the heart of what they were all sacrificing in their fight for justice. Thunderhorse knelt beside his daughter and spoke with gentle honesty about the difficult choices that lay ahead. "We might not be able to come back here for a long time, Little Moon, but sometimes we have to give up the things we love in order to protect the people we care about." His words were as much for Elizabeth as for his daughter. As they made their final preparations for departure, Elizabeth pulled Thunderhorse aside for a private conversation that would determine the course of everything that followed. "I want you to know that if something happens to me, the location of the other document sets is written in code on the back of this photograph." She pressed a small daguerreotype into his hands, a picture of herself, with an older woman who might have been her mother. The photograph was more than a sentimental keepsake. It was an insurance policy that could ensure the evidence of territorial corruption would survive even if Elizabeth didn't. Thunderhorse studied the seemingly innocent image, recognizing that what appeared to be random scratches and marks on the back were actually a carefully disguised map and set of instructions. "You promise me," Elizabeth said urgently, "that if I don't survive this, you'll make sure Captain Morrison gets that photograph and understands its importance. The people who have been victimized by this corruption deserve justice, even if I'm not alive to see it delivered." Her request was both a testament to her courage and a recognition of the very real possibility that their enemies might ultimately succeed in silencing her. Thunderhorse's plan required split-second timing and flawless execution as they abandoned the trading post that had been their home and sanctuary. Elizabeth, though still weak from her ordeal, demonstrated remarkable resilience as she helped load essential supplies onto their pack horses while Little Moon secured her most precious belongings in a small leather pouch that would travel with her throughout their dangerous journey. The route Thunderhorse had chosen led northwest into the Glacier Creek Valley, a treacherous stretch of wilderness that few white men had ever successfully navigated during winter conditions. The terrain was brutal, rocky gorges, dense forests, and mountain passes that could become death traps if the weather turned violent, but it also offered the advantage of being nearly impossible to track through once the snows began falling in earnest. As they prepared to depart, Thunderhorse made a calculated decision that would prove crucial to their survival. Instead of simply fleeing the area, He decided to implement a complex deception that would not only throw Coleman and his killers off their trail, but would also provide an opportunity to turn the hunters into the hunted. I'm going to make it appear that we fled in panic toward the Canadian border, Thunderhorse explained to Elizabeth as they mounted their horses in the pre-dawn darkness. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Coleman will find obvious signs of our hasty departure. Scattered belongings, clear tracks heading north, even some of your torn clothing caught on branches along the trail. He'll believe we're running scared toward the international boundary where American law enforcement can't follow. The deception was elaborate and risky. The first phase of their escape involved creating a false trail so convincing that even experienced trackers would be fooled into following it. Thunderhorse had spent hours the previous evening carefully staging evidence of their supposed flight, dropped supplies, overturned rocks that suggested panicked horses, and most convincingly, strands of Elizabeth's auburn hair deliberately snagged on thorny bushes at eye level where they couldn't be missed. Little Moon proved invaluable during this initial stage, her small size allowing her to move through dense underbrush and create the kind of subtle sign that suggested a child trying to keep up with fleeing adults. She scattered crumbs from their bread supplies and even left one of her handmade dolls partially buried in the mud near a creek crossing. Knowing that such a personal item would convince their pursuers they were on the right track. Elizabeth watched these preparations with a mixture of admiration and growing dread, recognizing that Thunderhorse was essentially betting all their lives on his ability to outsmart men who made their living through violence and intimidation. What if they don't take the bait? She asked quietly. What if Coleman is too experienced to be fooled by false trails and planted evidence? Her concerns were legitimate and terrifying. Thunderhorse's response revealed the depth of his commitment to their cause and his understanding of their enemy's psychology. Coleman is arrogant and desperate, and arrogant, desperate men make predictable mistakes. He's been humiliated by his failure to find you quickly, and he needs to show his employers that he's still capable of completing his mission. He'll follow any trail that promises to restore his reputation, even if part of him suspects it might be a trap. The analysis was cold and strategic. The actual direction of their flight led due west toward the Continental Divide, following ancient game trails that Thunderhorse had learned during his childhood travels with Cherokee hunting parties. These paths were invisible to anyone unfamiliar with the subtle signs that marked safe passage through some of the most dangerous terrain in the Montana Territory. As they rode deeper into the wilderness, Elizabeth began to understand the magnitude of the gamble they were taking. The route Thunderhorse had chosen would eventually lead them to Fort Ellis, where Captain Morrison could provide protection and ensure her evidence reached federal authorities. But the journey would take them through country where a single mistake could result in death from exposure, starvation, or worse. How long will it take to reach the fort? Elizabeth asked during their first rest stop, her voice showing strain from the physical demands of riding horseback while still recovering from her injuries. Thunderhorse's answer was both encouraging and sobering. 4 days, if the weather holds and we encounter no delays. But mountain weather is unpredictable, and we have other complications to consider. The other complications were the armed killers who would soon discover their deception. Little Moon had been unusually quiet during the early stages of their flight, but as they climbed higher into the foothills, her natural resilience and adventurous spirit began to reassert themselves. "Papa, are we going to see Captain Morrison's fort?" she asked excitedly. "Will there be soldiers there? Will they have a real cannon?" Her innocent enthusiasm provided a welcome contrast to the grim realities of their situation. Coleman and his 2 killers arrived at Thunderhorse's abandoned trading post just as the morning sun crested the eastern ridges. Their horses lathered from hard riding and their tempers shortened by several days of fruitless searching. The systematic destruction they had previously inflicted on the property made it difficult to determine what had been damaged during their earlier visit versus what might represent recent evidence of hasty departure. Hayes, the scarred gunman, was the first to notice that the obvious signs of flight were almost too convenient to be believable. "Look at this," he called to Coleman, pointing to a section of torn blue fabric hanging from a low branch directly beside the main trail leading north. "Either that woman is the clumsiest fugitive in the territory, or someone wants us to find this." His criminal experience had taught him to be suspicious of evidence that seemed too good to be true. Coleman dismounted and examined the planted evidence with growing irritation, recognizing the subtle signs that indicated deliberate staging rather than genuine panic. The scattered belongings were too randomly distributed, the horse tracks too clear and easy to follow, and the timing of their supposed departure too convenient, given the weather conditions. "We've been played," Coleman announced grimly, his pale eyes scanning the surrounding terrain with new understanding. "That Cherokee bastard is smarter than I gave him credit for. He sent us chasing shadows while he takes the woman in a completely different direction." The realization that he had been outwitted by a savage added humiliation to Coleman's growing fury. The older gunman, whose silence during their previous visit had marked him as the most experienced member of the group, finally spoke with the weary voice of a man who had seen too much violence and deception. "Question is, how long ago did they really leave, and which direction did they actually go? Could be anywhere in a 50-mile radius by now." His practical assessment highlighted the magnitude of their tracking problem. Coleman's response revealed both his desperation and his willingness to escalate the violence to unprecedented levels. "Then we split up and search every possible route until we find them. And when we do, I want that Cherokee alive long enough to regret making a fool out of me." The promise of torture was delivered with the casual tone of a man ordering breakfast. Hayes suggested a more systematic approach that would utilize their superior knowledge of the local terrain and their contacts among the criminal elements operating throughout the Montana Territory. "We got friends in every settlement from here to the Canadian border. Word gets out that we're looking for a Cherokee, his kid, and a white woman. Somebody's going to spot them eventually." The criminal network was extensive and efficient, but Coleman had already moved beyond simple manhunting to a strategy of total warfare that would terrorize the entire region into cooperation. "Send word to every contact we have between here and Fort Benton. Anyone who helps these fugitives dies, along with their families. Anyone who fails to report seeing them suffers the same fate. By the time we're finished, every person in the territory will be looking for our targets." The escalation was both strategic and psychopathic. The decision to expand their search into a region-wide campaign of intimidation would prove to be both Coleman's greatest strength and his fatal weakness. While it would mobilize dozens of allies and informants, it would also attract the attention of federal authorities who were already suspicious of the unusual criminal activity in the Montana Territory. Elizabeth's evidence had mentioned Captain Morrison at Fort Ellis, and unknown to Coleman, the captain had already been conducting his own quiet investigation into reports of government corruption and territorial violence. The sudden increase in criminal coordination would provide exactly the kind of proof Morrison needed to justify federal intervention. As Coleman and his men prepared to implement their expanded search strategy, they made a crucial error that would ultimately lead to their downfall. In their arrogance and desperation, they failed to consider that Thunderhorse might have allies of his own, men who owed him favors and who had their own reasons for wanting to see justice prevail in the Montana Territory. Thunderhorse's false trail had bought them exactly 18 hours before Coleman's men discovered the deception and began their real pursuit. The Cherokee warrior had used that time wisely, leading Elizabeth and Little Moon deep into the Glacier Creek wilderness along routes that would test even the most experienced mountain trackers. The terrain they were traversing had been shaped by ancient glacial activity, creating a maze of narrow canyons, hidden valleys, and treacherous rock formations that could conceal travelers from pursuit, but could also become deadly traps if the weather deteriorated. Thunderhorse navigated these hazards with the confidence of a man who had spent his entire life reading the subtle signs that marked safe passage through hostile country. Elizabeth's admiration for Thunderhorse's wilderness skills grew with each mile they traveled, as she began to understand the incredible complexity of the route he had chosen. "How do you know which way to go when everything looks the same?" she asked during one of their brief rest stops, genuinely amazed by his ability to find direction in seemingly featureless terrain. "The land speaks to those who know how to listen," Thunderhorse replied, pointing out subtle indicators that Elizabeth had never noticed. The way moss grew on certain sides of trees, how water flowed over rocks, the flight patterns of birds, and the direction of wind currents. "My grandfather taught me that every rock and tree and stream has a story to tell about the country around it. You just have to learn their language." His explanation revealed a deep, spiritual connection to the natural world. Little Moon had proven to be an excellent traveler, her small size and natural agility allowing her to navigate difficult terrain that would challenge many adults. But the physical demands of their journey were beginning to show, and Thunderhorse knew they would need to find shelter soon if they hoped to maintain their pace. The first real test of their escape route came when they reached Devil's Canyon, a narrow gorge that cut deep into the mountainside and offered the fastest passage toward Fort Ellis. The canyon was treacherous under the best conditions, with loose rock walls that could collapse without warning and a rushing creek that could become a deadly torrent during storms. "There's no other way," Thunderhorse explained as they studied the intimidating passage ahead. "This canyon will cut 2 days off our journey, but we'll be trapped in there if our enemies catch up with us. It's a calculated risk that could save us or kill us. The decision required weighing speed against safety in circumstances where both were crucial." Elizabeth studied the narrow canyon entrance with growing apprehension, recognizing that once they entered the gorge, they would be committed to a course of action that offered no retreat. "What happens if Coleman's men are waiting for us on the other side?" she asked, voicing the fear that all of them were feeling. Thunderhorse's answer revealed his growing confidence in their ability to outmaneuver their pursuers through superior knowledge of the terrain and weather conditions. "Coleman doesn't know this country well enough to anticipate our route, and his horses aren't conditioned for high-altitude travel. If we can maintain our lead through the canyon, we'll reach Fort Ellis before he can organize an effective pursuit." The strategy was sound, but far from certain. As they entered Devil's Canyon, the walls rose steeply on both sides, creating an echoing chamber where every sound was amplified and distorted. The rushing water made conversation difficult, but it also provided cover for the noise of their horses' hooves on the rocky canyon floor. Thunderhorse took the lead, testing each step carefully for loose stones that might trigger rock slides. The journey through the canyon proved to be both physically exhausting and psychologically nerve-wracking, as they navigated a route that seemed designed to test human courage and endurance. Elizabeth found herself fighting claustrophobia as the walls closed in around them, while Little Moon pressed close to her father's horse, seeking comfort in his calm presence. Halfway through the canyon, they encountered the obstacle that Thunderhorse had been dreading, a rockfall that partially blocked their path, forcing them to dismount and lead their horses over treacherous footing while exposed to potential attack from above. The delay was unavoidable but dangerous, giving their pursuers additional time to close the gap. What Thunderhorse hadn't anticipated was that Coleman's criminal network extended far beyond simple hired killers and corrupt officials. Among the many individuals who owed favors to the territorial corruption ring was a Cherokee trader named Joseph Crow Feather, a man whose gambling debts and poor judgment had made him vulnerable to blackmail and coercion. Crow Feather had been watching the mountain trails for 3 days, positioned at a strategic overlook where he could observe the approaches to Fort Ellis while maintaining contact with Coleman's search parties. His knowledge of Cherokee tracking methods and traditional travel routes made him the perfect tool for intercepting Thunderhorse's carefully planned escape. The betrayal came just as Thunderhorse, Elizabeth, and Little Moon emerged from Devil's Canyon, exhausted from their perilous passage, but confident they had successfully evaded their pursuers. Crow Feather approached them with the casual manner of a fellow traveler seeking company, his familiar face and Cherokee speech causing Thunderhorse to lower his guard at the worst possible moment. "Brother, it is good to see you alive," Crow Feather called out in Cherokee as he rode toward them with apparent relief and friendship. "There are bad men searching for you throughout the territory. You need to change your route if you hope to reach safety." His warning seemed genuine and helpful, exactly the kind of assistance Thunderhorse had been hoping to receive from his own people. Elizabeth immediately sensed something wrong with the encounter, her experience with deception and betrayal having sharpened her instincts for detecting false friendship. "Something about him doesn't feel right," she whispered urgently to Thunderhorse. "The way he's positioned his horse, the way he keeps looking back toward the canyon, I think he's been waiting for us." Her warning came almost too late. Thunderhorse's realization of the betrayal came just as Crow Feather's hand moved toward the rifle secured to his saddle, but the Cherokee warrior's combat reflexes were faster than his opponent's greed. The confrontation that followed was brief but violent, as two men who shared ancestry and culture found themselves on opposite sides of a conflict that transcended tribal loyalty. Little Moon's scream of terror as the two Cherokee men grappled for control of Crow Feather's weapon served as a stark reminder of what was at stake in their desperate flight toward safety. Elizabeth grabbed the child and pulled her behind the cover of a large boulder, while Thunderhorse fought for their lives against a man who had sold his soul to their enemies. The fight ended when Crow Feather's own weapon discharged during their struggle, the bullet finding its mark in the traitor's chest and ending his threat permanently. But the gunshot had served its intended purpose. Within minutes, answering shots echoed from the direction of Devil's Canyon, indicating that Coleman and his killers had finally caught up with their quarry. "We have to run," Thunderhorse announced grimly as he secured Crow Feather's weapons and supplies to their own horses. "The sound will bring them directly to us, and we're still 8 miles from Fort Ellis." The final race for safety was about to begin, with death following close behind them through the Montana wilderness. Elizabeth looked back toward the canyon with despair, realizing that their carefully planned escape had been compromised by treachery within Thunderhorse's own community. "Will we make it?" she asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Thunderhorse's response was grim but determined. "We'll make it or we'll die trying. Either way, your evidence will reach the people who can use it to bring justice." The promise carried the weight of a warrior's oath. The thundering hooves of Coleman's pursuit echoed off the canyon walls. Behind them, as Thunderhorse pushed their exhausted horses toward the final 8 miles that separated them from the safety of Fort Ellis, Elizabeth clutched Little Moon tightly as they galloped across the treacherous mountain terrain, her heart pounding with the knowledge that capture now would mean certain death for all of them, and the permanent burial of evidence that could expose decades of territorial corruption. Thunderhorse's intimate knowledge of every trail, creek, and hidden passage in the region became their salvation as he led them through a series of shortcuts that cut precious minutes from their journey while making pursuit increasingly difficult for their enemies. The route required split-second timing and absolute trust in his judgment. As they leaped their horses across ravines and navigated narrow ledges that would have challenged experienced mountain riders under normal circumstances, Little Moon demonstrated remarkable courage throughout the desperate flight, never once crying out in fear despite the obvious danger they faced. Her small hands gripped Elizabeth's waist with surprising strength, and her dark eyes remained alert for the landmarks her father had taught her to recognize during their peaceful rides through the mountains in happier times. "There," Thunderhorse called out, pointing toward a distinctive rock formation that marked their proximity to Fort Ellis. "2 more miles, and we'll be within range of the fort's sentries." His words carried hope, but Elizabeth could hear the exhaustion in his voice and see the labored breathing of their horses, who had been pushed beyond their normal limits during the harrowing chase. Behind them, Coleman's voice could be heard shouting orders to his men as they closed the distance with grim determination. "Don't let them reach the fort alive. Kill the Cherokee and the kid if you have to, but bring me that woman and whatever evidence she's carrying." The desperation in his commands revealed how much was at stake for the corrupt network he represented. The sound of gunfire erupted as Coleman's killers began shooting at them across the diminishing gap, their bullets whistling through the mountain air and striking rocks dangerously close to the fleeing horses. Elizabeth felt a surge of terror as she realized they might not survive the final minutes of their journey. Despite having come so far and endured so much, Thunderhorse made a tactical decision that would either save their lives or end them in a blaze of gunfire. Instead of continuing on the main trail toward Fort Ellis, he suddenly veered left toward a steep hillside that would provide cover from their pursuers, but would also slow their own progress significantly. "Hold on," he called back to Elizabeth and Little Moon as their horses began climbing the rocky slope. The maneuver worked exactly as Thunderhorse had hoped, forcing Coleman's men to dismount and continue their pursuit on foot through terrain that heavily favored defenders over attackers. The temporary respite allowed Thunderhorse to reach into his saddlebags and retrieve the emergency signal mirror he had carried since his army scouting days. Using the afternoon sun, Thunderhorse began flashing coded signals toward Fort Ellis, sending the agreed-upon distress call that would alert Captain Morrison to their desperate situation. The bright reflections caught the attention of the fort's lookouts almost immediately, and within minutes, answering signals confirmed that help was on the way. Elizabeth watched with amazement as Thunderhorse communicated across miles of wilderness, using nothing more than reflected sunlight, his fingers working the mirror with the precision of a telegraph operator. "How did you learn to do that?" she asked breathlessly, though their circumstances hardly allowed for casual conversation. "Army training," Thunderhorse replied tersely, as he continued signaling their exact position and the number of armed pursuers they faced. "Captain Morrison and I developed this system during our campaigns against hostile bands in the territory. He'll know exactly what it means and how to respond." The military connection that had seemed like their best hope for justice was now proving to be their salvation. The distinctive sound of a cavalry bugle echoing across the mountainside was the most beautiful music Elizabeth had ever heard, signaling that Captain Morrison had received Thunderhorse's distress signals and was responding with overwhelming force. A full troop of mounted soldiers appeared on the ridge above Fort Ellis, their blue uniforms and flashing sabers creating an inspiring sight that filled the fugitives with renewed hope. Coleman's reaction to the arrival of federal cavalry was immediate and telling, as he ordered his men to cease their pursuit and attempt to withdraw before they could be captured or identified. But Captain Morrison had anticipated this response and had positioned additional troops to cut off the most likely escape routes, creating a military trap that would finally bring the corrupt killers to justice. "Surrender your weapons and submit to federal custody," Captain Morrison's voice boomed across the mountainside as his cavalry surrounded Coleman's position. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and crimes against the territorial government of Montana." The formal charges rang out with the authority of the United States Army behind them. Hayes, the scarred gunman who had proven to be the most vicious of Coleman's associates, made the fatal mistake of drawing his weapon and attempting to shoot his way out of the military encirclement. The responding volley from a dozen cavalry carbines ended his criminal career permanently and served as a stark warning to his surviving companions. Coleman himself proved to be a coward when faced with superior force and certain capture, immediately attempting to negotiate by offering information about his employers and associates in exchange for leniency. "I can give you names, Captain," he called out desperately. "Important people, powerful people who've been running this operation for years. I'm just a hired hand following orders." His willingness to betray his accomplices revealed the true character beneath his veneer of authority. Captain Morrison's response was coldly professional as he ordered his men to secure the prisoners and collect their weapons. "You'll have plenty of opportunity to discuss your associates with federal prosecutors, Coleman. Right now, my immediate concern is ensuring the safety of the witnesses you've been trying to murder." The captain's priorities were clear and reassuring. Thunderhorse, Elizabeth, and Little Moon were escorted down from their defensive position by a squad of cavalry troopers who treated them with the respect due to heroes rather than fugitives. Captain Morrison personally greeted Thunderhorse with the warmth of an old friend and comrade in arms, their reunion marking the end of a nightmare that had begun with chains and terror. "You took a hell of a risk, old friend," Captain Morrison said as he clasped Thunderhorse's hand in greeting. "When I got your signals, I wasn't sure we'd reach you in time." The admission revealed how close they had come to disaster and how crucial Thunderhorse's military training had been to their survival. Elizabeth found herself overwhelmed with emotion as she realized they had actually survived the ordeal and reached safety with her evidence intact. The relief was so intense that she began to weep, her tears carrying away weeks of accumulated fear, pain, and desperation. Little Moon immediately moved to comfort her, showing the kind of empathy that marked the child as special. "It's over now," Little Moon said softly, patting Elizabeth's hand with the gentle wisdom of someone much older than her years. "The bad men can't hurt you anymore, and Papa's friend is going to make sure they get punished for what they did." The child's confidence in justice was absolute and infectious. Captain Morrison's examination of Elizabeth's evidence confirmed its devastating impact on the territorial corruption network that had operated with impunity for so many years. "This documentation is extraordinary," he told her with genuine admiration. "With this level of detail and corroboration, we can bring down the entire criminal organization and recover millions of dollars in stolen federal funds." The scope of justice that would follow was breathtaking. The trials that followed Elizabeth's testimony became the most significant legal proceedings in Montana Territory's history, exposing a web of corruption that reached from local officials to territorial governors and involving some of the wealthiest and most powerful individuals in the region. Elizabeth's meticulous documentation provided prosecutors with an unshakable foundation for criminal charges that would result in dozens of convictions and the recovery of vast sums of stolen money. Harrison Blackwood, the territorial official who had orchestrated Elizabeth's attempted murder, was among the first to be arrested when federal marshals arrived in Helena with warrants based on her evidence. His attempts to destroy incriminating documents and flee to Mexico were thwarted by the speed and efficiency of the federal response, leaving him facing charges that would result in life imprisonment. The impact of the corruption exposure extended far beyond simple criminal justice, as the recovered funds were used to provide long overdue supplies and services to Native American reservations throughout the territory. Thunderhorse had the satisfaction of knowing that his courage in protecting Elizabeth had directly benefited his own people and countless other victims of the criminal network. Elizabeth's role as a federal witness required her to remain in protective custody at Fort Ellis for several months while the various trials proceeded, but the time was far from unpleasant. She found herself becoming an integral part of the fort's community. using her bookkeeping skills to help organize the post's financial records and teaching reading and writing to soldiers who had never received formal education. Little Moon thrived in the fort environment, where she was treated as a beloved mascot by the cavalry troopers and received the kind of education that would have been impossible at the isolated trading post. Her natural intelligence and curiosity impressed the fort's chaplain, who began providing her with advanced instruction in reading, writing, and arithmetic. Thunderhorse divided his time between serving as a scout and guide for the federal investigations and working to rebuild his trading post, which had been severely damaged during Coleman's searches. The army provided materials and labor to assist with the reconstruction, recognizing his crucial role in exposing the territorial corruption. The most satisfying moment of the entire legal proceedings came when Marshal Coleman, faced with overwhelming evidence and the testimony of his surviving associates, finally confessed his crimes in open court. His detailed admission provided the final pieces needed to complete the prosecution's case and ensured that justice would be served for all of the corruption network's victims. Elizabeth's testimony before the territorial grand jury was praised by federal prosecutors as the most comprehensive and compelling presentation of evidence they had ever witnessed. Her courage in preserving and presenting the documentation despite threats to her life made her a hero to honest citizens throughout the Montana Territory and beyond. The financial recovery from the corruption cases was substantial enough to fund major improvements in territorial infrastructure, including new schools, hospitals, and transportation systems that would benefit all residents regardless of their race or social status. Elizabeth's sacrifice had literally transformed the future of the entire region. Captain Morrison's official report on the case praised Thunderhorse's courage and tactical brilliance in protecting Elizabeth and ensuring her evidence reached federal authorities. The report recommended Thunderhorse for a civilian citation, recognizing his service to justice and his country, an honor that was approved by the territorial governor and presented in a formal ceremony at Fort Ellis. 6 months after their harrowing escape through the Montana wilderness, Elizabeth stood in the rebuilt trading post, watching Thunderhorse and Little Moon work together to plant a garden where vegetables and flowers would grow in the fertile soil of their mountain valley. The scene was peaceful and hopeful, a stark contrast to the violence and terror that had brought them together. The question of Elizabeth's future had been resolved through discussions that involved all 3 members of their unlikely family. Thunderhorse had formally asked Elizabeth to remain with them permanently, not just as a guest or employee, but as an equal partner in rebuilding their lives and their business. Little Moon had enthusiastically supported the proposal, having grown to love Elizabeth as the mother she had never really known. Elizabeth's acceptance of Thunderhorse's proposal had surprised no one who had witnessed the deep bonds that had formed between them during their shared ordeal. Their relationship had evolved from desperate necessity to genuine affection and mutual respect, creating the foundation for a partnership that would endure whatever challenges the future might bring. The wedding ceremony that united Thunderhorse and Elizabeth was conducted according to Cherokee traditions, with Captain Morrison serving as an honored witness and Little Moon playing a central role as the bridge between her father's past and their family's future. The celebration that followed brought together soldiers from Fort Ellis, local ranchers, and members of various tribal communities in a demonstration of unity that would have seemed impossible before their shared struggle for justice. Little Moon's education continued under Elizabeth's guidance, with the child showing remarkable aptitude for languages, mathematics, and the kind of creative problem-solving that had helped save their lives during their flight from Coleman's killers. Her bilingual abilities and cultural knowledge made her an ideal interpreter and mediator between different communities in the territory. The trading post prospered under Elizabeth's financial management and Thunder Horse's wilderness expertise, becoming a hub of commerce and communication that served travelers from throughout the Montana Territory. Their reputation for honesty and fair dealing attracted customers who traveled considerable distances to do business with people they could trust. Elizabeth's skills as a bookkeeper and financial analyst made her invaluable to territorial officials who were working to rebuild honest government institutions in the wake of the corruption scandals. Her consulting work with various agencies provided additional income while allowing her to ensure that the reforms implemented would prevent future criminal exploitation. Thunder Horse's role as a federal scout and guide expanded significantly as his reputation for courage and reliability became known throughout the military establishment. His knowledge of the terrain and his ability to work effectively with people from diverse backgrounds made him indispensable for missions requiring cultural sensitivity and tactical expertise. The final scene of their remarkable story showed the three of them standing together on the porch of their rebuilt home, watching the sunset paint the Montana mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Little Moon, now 8 years old and growing rapidly, stood between her father and Elizabeth with the confident posture of a child who knew she was loved and protected. "Papa," Little Moon said softly, echoing the question that had started their incredible journey months earlier. "Remember when you asked me why that lady wouldn't move when we found her by the tree?" Thunder Horse nodded, his arm around Elizabeth's shoulders as they remembered that terrible day that had changed all their lives. Elizabeth smiled as she provided the answer that had taken months to fully understand. "I couldn't move because I had given up hope that anyone would care enough to help me. But your papa and you showed me that even when everything seems lost, there are still people in the world who will risk everything to do what's right." Her words carried the wisdom earned through suffering and the joy discovered through unexpected love. Thunder Horse's final words summarized the transformation they had all experienced. Sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the greatest challenges. We thought we were just saving one person's life, but we ended up saving each other and bringing justice to thousands of people we'll never meet. The truth of his observation was evident in the peaceful happiness that surrounded their mountain home. The stars began to appear in the darkening sky above the Montana Territory, each point of light representing hope and possibility in a land where justice had finally prevailed over corruption, where love had triumphed over hate, and where three unlikely souls had found in each other the family they had all been searching for without knowing it. The mountain valley that had once held only Thunder Horse's isolated trading post had transformed into a thriving settlement known throughout the Montana Territory as Stone Creek. Named in honor of Elizabeth's courage and the solid foundation of justice she had helped establish. Where once a single log cabin had stood against the wilderness, now a proper town stretched along the creek bottom, complete with a general store, schoolhouse, blacksmith shop, and even a small church that served the diverse community that had grown around the original trading post. Elizabeth Stonehorse stood on the covered porch of their expanded home, watching her 13-year-old daughter. Little Moon led a group of younger children in their afternoon lessons beneath the shade of the cottonwood trees that Thunder Horse had planted to commemorate each year of their marriage. The scene filled Elizabeth with a deep satisfaction that went far beyond personal happiness, representing the kind of peaceful, prosperous community that her evidence had helped make possible throughout the territory. Thunder Horse himself had adapted to his role as the unofficial mayor and leading citizen of Stone Creek with the same quiet competence he had brought to every other challenge in his life. His combination of Cherokee wisdom, military experience, and natural leadership abilities made him the person everyone turned to when disputes needed settling or important decisions required making. The success of Stone Creek represented more than just economic prosperity. It had become a model for the kind of integrated community that was emerging throughout the reformed Montana Territory, where Native Americans, white settlers, former slaves, and immigrants from various European countries worked together as equals rather than viewing each other with suspicion and hostility. Elizabeth's role in the community extended far beyond her duties as wife, mother, and business partner. Her expertise in financial matters and her experience in exposing government corruption had made her an invaluable consultant to territorial officials who were still working to implement the reforms that had emerged from the trials 5 years earlier. The schoolhouse that served Stone Creek and the surrounding ranches was Elizabeth's particular pride, representing her commitment to ensuring that the next generation would receive the education necessary to prevent the kind of ignorance and prejudice that had enabled the corruption network to operate with impunity for so many years. Little Moon's education under Elizabeth's guidance had progressed far beyond what would have been possible at a traditional frontier school, encompassing not only basic academic subjects but also advanced studies in law, government, and international relations. The young woman's intelligence and natural curiosity had impressed visiting officials and educators who predicted a bright future in territorial service or even federal government positions. The relationship between Little Moon and Elizabeth had evolved from the desperate circumstances of their first meeting into the kind of deep mother-daughter bond that transcended blood relations and cultural differences. Elizabeth's influence had helped Little Moon develop into a confident, articulate young woman who was equally comfortable in Cherokee traditions and modern American society. Thunderhorse took immense pride in watching his daughter grow into someone who could navigate both worlds with equal skill, representing the best aspects of both Cherokee heritage and American opportunity. His own role in her development had focused on teaching her the traditional skills and values that would keep her grounded in her cultural identity while she pursued broader horizons. Among the newer residents of Stone Creek was Dr. James Morrison, Captain Morrison's younger brother, who had established the territory's first fully equipped medical practice in their community. His presence had dramatically improved healthcare for everyone in the region, while also providing Little Moon with exposure to modern scientific and medical knowledge. The young woman's interests had begun to focus particularly on legal studies and government policy, areas where her unique background and cultural knowledge could contribute to the ongoing work of territorial reform and development. Elizabeth had been encouraging these interests while also ensuring that Little Moon understood the responsibilities that came with such opportunities. Elizabeth's own continuing education had kept pace with her daughter's development, as she pursued advanced studies in law and economics through correspondence courses with Eastern universities. Her goal was to ensure that she could continue serving as an effective advocate for territorial reform, while also supporting Little Moon's academic and professional development. The legal proceedings that had grown out of Elizabeth's evidence had continued for years beyond the initial trials, as federal prosecutors methodically dismantled the entire network of corruption that had plagued the Montana Territory. The scope of the criminal enterprise had proved to be even more extensive than Elizabeth's original documentation had suggested, involving dozens of additional individuals and millions of dollars in stolen funds. Harrison Blackwood's conviction and life sentence had been only the beginning of a legal process that ultimately resulted in the prosecution of 3 territorial governors, 7 federal officials, and dozens of local politicians and businessmen. The recovered funds had been used to establish educational and healthcare systems throughout the territory, while also compensating many of the individual victims of the corruption scheme. Elizabeth's role as a key witness in these extended proceedings had required her to travel frequently to Helena and other territorial centers, experiences that had broadened her understanding of government operations, while also reinforcing her commitment to continued reform efforts. Her testimony had been crucial in securing convictions in cases where documentary evidence alone might not have been sufficient. Thunder Horse's reputation as a reliable and courageous individual had led to his appointment as a special federal marshal, a position that allowed him to participate directly in the ongoing investigation and prosecution of territorial crimes. His cultural knowledge and wilderness skills had proved invaluable in tracking down fugitive criminals who had fled to remote areas following the initial prosecutions. The long-term economic benefits of eliminating the corruption network had exceeded even the most optimistic projections, as legitimate businesses and honest officials had been able to develop the territory's resources in ways that benefited entire communities, rather than enriching a few criminals at everyone else's expense. Captain Morrison's career had advanced significantly as a result of his role in exposing the territorial corruption, leading to his promotion to colonel and his assignment to oversee similar reform efforts in other Western territories. His friendship with Thunder Horse had continued to provide valuable support for Stone Creek's development and Little Moon's educational opportunities. As the sun set over Stone Creek on the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Thunder Horse, Elizabeth, and Little Moon gathered on their porch to reflect on the journey that had brought them from desperation and terror to peace and prosperity. The evening light painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, creating a scene of natural beauty that perfectly complemented the human happiness they had built together. Elizabeth's thoughts turned to the question that had haunted her during those dark days when she had been chained to a tree with a sack over her head, convinced that she would die alone and forgotten in the wilderness. The woman who had given up hope had been transformed into someone whose courage and determination had changed the lives of thousands of people throughout the Montana Territory. Thunder Horse's reflections focused on the Cherokee teaching that every person has a responsibility to leave the world better than they found it, a principle that had guided his decision to risk everything to protect a stranger who needed help. The trading post that had been his retreat from the world had become the center of a community that embodied the best values of both Cherokee and American culture. Little Moon's perspective encompassed both the past they had survived and the future she was preparing to embrace. Recognizing that her unique background and education had prepared her for opportunities that previous generations of Native American women could never have imagined. Her plans included law school in the East and eventual return to Montana to continue the reform work that her parents had begun. The bonds that united their family had been forged in crisis and strengthened through shared purpose, creating a foundation of love and mutual respect that would endure whatever challenges the future might bring. Their story had demonstrated that families formed by choice and commitment could be just as strong as those created by blood and tradition. The community that had grown around them in Stone Creek represented a vision of American society that transcended racial and cultural divisions, proving that people of different backgrounds could work together successfully when they shared common values of honesty, fairness, and mutual respect. The settlement had become a beacon of hope for similar communities throughout the expanding nation. Elizabeth's final thoughts, as she watched the stars appear in the darkening sky, returned to the moment when Little Moon had first asked her father why the strange woman wouldn't move. The question had led to a rescue that became a transformation, demonstrating that even in the darkest circumstances, human compassion and courage could create miracles. Thunder Horse's final words summarized the transformation they had all experienced and the hope they had created for others. We began this journey as strangers brought together by violence and desperation, but we discovered that love and justice are more powerful than hate and corruption. That discovery changed not only our own lives, but the lives of everyone who came after us. His observation captured the essence of their remarkable story. The stars that had witnessed their desperate flight through the Montana wilderness now looked down on a peaceful community where children played safely. Families prospered through honest work, and justice prevailed over violence. The question, "Papa, why won't she move?" had found its answer in the love that had transformed 3 lives and countless others, proving that even the most broken spirits could be healed by compassion and courage. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.